Chosen one, pause for a moment and truly take this in with full presence. Something has taken place recently in your life. A decision you followed through on, and a step you chose to take, even though it asked something real from you, something that required effort, courage, and inner stability. That moment carries far more weight than you may currently realize, because it was not just another action in your journey, but a turning point that holds deeper significance beneath the surface of what you can immediately see. It was seen in a way that goes beyond human recognition, held and understood by the one who sees the full depth of your process. Every sacrifice you made, quietly every hesitation you had to move through, and every moment you chose to continue when it would have been easier to stop. Nothing about that step was overlooked, even if it felt unseen in the moment, and the depth of what it cost you was fully understood in a way that only that level of awareness could hold. There is a reason this message has reached you exactly where you are right now. You are not here by coincidence, and on some level, something within you already recognizes that truth. A part of you has been sensing a subtle shift in the atmosphere, an internal change that is difficult to fully explain with words, but can definitely be felt as a quiet inner awareness. It is the kind of knowing that arrives before any external confirmation appears, the sense that something is shifting long before the outside world catches up to what has already begun inside you. What you are sensing is real and grounded in something deeper than wishful thinking or emotional projection. It is the part of you that can recognize movement beneath the surface, the part that can feel when something that has been forming over time is finally beginning to emerge into a new phase. And one of the reasons the waiting season lasted as long as it did is because there was still something within you that needed to be shaped, refined, and stabilized before what was meant for you could fully enter your life. The step you recently took may have appeared small or simple from the outside, but its significance reaches much deeper than its external form. It required a kind of courage that often goes unnoticed because it happens quietly within, in the private space of your own inner world, where decisions are made without applause or recognition. You moved forward at a moment when stepping back would have felt easier and more familiar, and you remained faithful when almost every visible sign around you suggested that letting go would have been the safer option. When I speak about power in this context, I am not referring to visible achievements or moments that draw attention from others. I am referring to the quiet strength it takes to remain aligned with what you know to be right, even when resistance surrounds you and certainty has not yet fully arrived. True strength reveals itself when a person continues forward despite uncertainty, when they stay connected to their calling, even when the conditions around them remain incomplete and uncomfortable. And that is exactly what happened with you in that moment. You chose faithfulness in the middle of pressure, and you chose to stay with the path in front of you, even when postponing it would have felt safer and less demanding. In a deeper sense, that kind of response reflects something powerful within you, because it reveals a form of trust that is not superficial or temporary, but something tested through experience and sustained through inner conviction. There are moments in life when a single decision quietly begins to reshape everything that follows, not because the person making it is perfect or fully certain, but because the choice itself carries enough sincerity and alignment to shift the direction of what comes next. I believe the step you took was one of those moments, and the fact that you are receiving this now is not separate from that decision, but connected to it in a meaningful way. The waiting is over. Hear that clearly and allow it to land fully, not as a temporary comfort or an emotional reassurance meant to lift your mood, but as an invitation to recognize that something fundamental has already shifted beneath the surface of your life. The circumstances around you may still be unfolding and taking shape, but the underlying condition that sustained the long season of waiting has already changed. What was needed for your preparation has already been formed, and the version of you that had to emerge through that process is now here. The season that once felt like delay was never empty or wasted. It was actively building strength, clarity, emotional endurance, and depth within you, even in moments where it felt like nothing was happening. And now there is a quiet recognition that what needed to be completed within you has reached its natural threshold. The focus is no longer on formation in the same way. It is shifted into readiness, into a state where what has been built is now prepared to be carried forward. What many people do not realize is that the end of a waiting season rarely arrives in a dramatic or sudden way. More often, it unfolds through subtle movement that is easy to overlook unless you are paying close attention. A conversation that once felt blocked begins to flow again. An opportunity appears where there seemed to be no opening at all, or a situation that once felt like a barrier slowly reveals itself as a path forward. In that process, the overall pattern begins to change. What once felt closed starts to open, what felt stagnant begins to move, and the emotional atmosphere shifts from stillness into forward motion. If you have started noticing even small signs of this kind of movement in your own experience, there is a strong possibility that you are already stepping into the early stages of what you have been waiting for without fully naming it yet. In this moment, the most important shift is not about forcing anything to happen, but about learning how to recognize what is already unfolding. It is about allowing yourself to see what is opening instead of constantly trying to push for more, and learning to position yourself to receive what is arriving rather than exhausting yourself trying to create it through effort alone. If this speaks to something within you and you recognize your own experience in these words, you can mark that recognition with 777 in the comments. And if you understand that the step being described is the one you recently took, the one that required quiet strength and personal sacrifice, then allow yourself to acknowledge that you are here, present, and ready to receive what is beginning to unfold. And there is something else that is important to understand more deeply. That decision did not come from a single isolated moment. It was the result of many smaller choices made over a long period of time. Every time you kept going, when it would have been easier to stop, every moment you stayed committed, when there was little external confirmation, and every instance where you chose authenticity over appearance or faithfulness over performance, you were gradually becoming a different version of yourself. Those accumulated moments were what built the foundation of the version of you that could eventually make that decisive step. The strength behind it was not created overnight. It was formed slowly through every challenge, every setback, and every quiet act of perseverance that came before it, shaping something within you that is now stable enough to carry what is ahead. That is also why the resistance mattered so much. It was never simply an obstacle standing in your way. It was part of what shaped your preparation, refining you in ways that could not have happened without that pressure. What was developed within you through those difficult experiences is exactly what the next season will require. And that understanding becomes especially important as you begin to see what all of this has been leading you toward. There is a quiet tendency that often begins to surface toward the end of a long waiting season, and it is so subtle that most people only recognize it after it has already begun shaping the way they see themselves. It is the tendency to minimize what they have been through, to look back at everything they endured and slowly convince themselves that it was not as heavy as it actually felt. In real time, you start comparing your path to others, telling yourself that someone else had it worse, or that you should not need any form of recognition for simply surviving what was expected of you. On the surface, this can resemble humility or even emotional self-protection, but underneath it quietly reshapes how you relate to your own strength and resilience. What gradually begins to happen is a subtle shrinking of awareness. You start to forget just how much endurance it took to remain consistent, how much invisible pressure you were carrying without allowing it to pull you off your direction or break your focus. Over time, this soft distortion leads you to enter a new season with less recognition of what was actually built within you than what is truly accurate. There is less awareness of your readiness and less trust in the very capacities that were formed through everything you had to move through and overcome. This is not about inflating the ego or rewriting your story into something it is not. It is about seeing it clearly, without minimizing it, and without the filters that time and exhaustion can quietly create. Because of you once saw 3 hours and a Troy song, seconds long, costly and deeply sustained from you. And what was formed within you through that process is equally real, even if it did not always feel like growth while you were inside it. That kind of clarity is not something you simply think about in passing. It is something you carry with you into the next phase of your life. The season you are stepping into now requires a level of self-recognition that matches the depth of what was actually developed inside you during that time. And there is something important to understand here. There is a pattern that appears repeatedly in people who are standing right at the edge of a meaningful shift. Just before things begin to open, there is often a moment where they feel like stopping or stepping back, not because nothing is happening, but because the emotional weight of waiting becomes overwhelming. In that space, doubt tends to grow louder, and the mind begins to question whether what they have been holding on to is still real, or whether it was only ever hope stretched across too much time and uncertainty. And almost every time, that moment of almost letting go sits right beside the moment where things begin to move. It is as if the threshold itself brings forward the final layer of resistance. The last internal test of whether what you carried was genuine conviction or only emotional endurance stretched over time. The ones who move through that point are not necessarily the ones who felt the strongest in every moment. They are the ones who, even in exhaustion and uncertainty, made a quiet and steady decision to continue without needing the external world to change first. If you are here in this moment, there is a chance you recognize that feeling very clearly. Maybe you have already crossed through that edge and are only now seeing it from the other side, or maybe you are still standing right within it, where everything inside you is asking for relief. Yet something deeper continues to hold you steady, just enough to keep going. And before moving further, there is something important to hold gently in your awareness. There are layers of transition in a person's life that go deeper than mindset, motivation, or emotional resilience alone. The way you receive what is beginning to move toward you is not only shaped by what you believe, but also by how prepared your internal system is to actually hold and integrate it when it arrives. Most people never consider that deeper layer, but it plays a far more significant role than they realize. Because even when someone is emotionally aware and spiritually aligned, there are still internal mechanisms that influence how clearly they can recognize, receive, and fully integrate what begins to unfold in their life. And sometimes what feels like delay is not distance or denial at all. It is depth. It is the time required for the internal structure to expand enough to hold what is being prepared for them without collapsing under its weight. I want you to hold that idea gently for a moment, because as we continue, it will begin to make even more sense in the context of everything you have experienced. Now, there are ways to recognize when a season is beginning to shift, even when nothing on the surface appears dramatically different. These signs are often quiet, subtle, and easy to overlook if you are expecting something obvious or immediate. One of the earliest shifts appears in the way resistance feels. In earlier stages, it tends to feel scattered and overwhelming, as if everything is pushing against you at once from every direction, creating constant friction no matter where you try to move. But as you move closer to a real transition, that resistance begins to change form. It becomes more concentrated, almost directional in nature. Instead of feeling like everything is against you, it begins to feel like pressure is coming from a very specific point, connected to the exact direction you are already moving toward. And interestingly, this kind of focused resistance often signals proximity rather than setback. It suggests that you are no longer lost in uncertainty, but moving along a defined path that is approaching a turning point. Another shift becomes visible in your sense of purpose. It grows less emotional, less dependent on external validation, and more quietly anchored within you. What once needed constant reassurance from the outside world begins to stand on its own with a steadier presence. There is a quiet certainty that does not require repetition or confirmation to remain intact. It simply exists, stable and clear, even in the absence of external signs. And then there are moments when life begins to open in ways you did not plan or anticipate. Opportunities, conversations, or connections start to appear from directions you were not actively focusing on. Things you had set aside or assumed were no longer relevant begin to re-enter your life with unexpected timing and a different sense of possibility. It does not feel like something you forced into existence, but rather something that has been unfolding quietly in the background and is now slowly rising into view. These kinds of openings carry a different kind of quality. They do not feel manufactured or forced into place. Instead, they feel arranged in a subtle way, as if pieces you could not fully see before are gradually beginning to align on their own. And what is most important to understand is that none of this only changes your external circumstances. It also changes something within you at the same time, and often that internal shift is even more significant than anything happening on the outside. Even though the external changes are usually what people notice first, there is a kind of rest that begins to emerge when you enter what I would call the arrival season. And it carries a very different quality from the rest you may have known before. This is not the kind of rest that comes from stepping away from everything or temporarily setting life down to breathe. It is something deeper and more internal than that. Something that quietly settles in when striving is no longer what you rely on to stay aligned with what you are becoming. In the season before this, striving was often what held you together and kept you moving forward. You were holding on to belief even in moments when nothing around you reflected it back. And you were carrying faith through stretches of time where there was no external confirmation to support it. You were staying connected to something within yourself, even when the outer world felt uncertain, heavy, or unresponsive. That kind of effort had a purpose in its time, and although it may not have always felt meaningful while you were inside it, it was actively shaping you and strengthening you in ways that were not always visible in the moment. But there eventually comes a point where that internal posture begins to shift in a noticeable way. What once required constant effort begins to feel different, as if something in you is being invited to loosen its grip rather than tighten it further. Instead of always reaching forward and trying to hold everything together through force of will, there is a quieter invitation toward allowing things to unfold. Instead of carrying everything through tension, there is a deeper sense that you're being asked to remain open and receptive. For someone who has spent a long time in a state of reaching and striving, the shift can feel unfamiliar at first and even slightly uncomfortable, because it asks you to move in a way that is not yet fully habitual. Still, recognizing this shift is important because what once demanded constant effort no longer requires the same kind of force. The season itself has changed, and the way you relate to what is unfolding has to shift with it in a natural way. There comes a moment where you begin to understand that reaching harder is no longer what creates movement. What is needed now is presence, openness, and a willingness to receive what is already beginning to move toward you without resistance. If you can sense even a subtle change in yourself right now, even a quiet awareness that striving is not holding the same weight it used to, then you are already entering into this adjustment. You are beginning to step into a different way of engaging with your path, one that feels less like constant pursuit and more like slowly recognizing what is already arriving in your life. And I want to pause here for a moment and speak directly to something important about the decision you made earlier in your journey. Because there is a layer of that moment that deserves to be seen with more clarity. That decision was not only an act of courage in isolation, but also a response to timing in a way that is often difficult to recognize while you are living through it. There are rare moments in life where what you feel drawn toward and the timing of that calling align in the same space. In those moments, it becomes less about trying to decide whether to move and more about recognizing that something is already unfolding and you are being invited to step into it. Those openings do not remain available indefinitely. They require a kind of responsiveness that trusts the direction you are sensing before everything becomes fully clear. What you did in that moment was enter into that alignment. You moved at a time when both direction and timing were quietly meeting, even if it did not feel fully certain on the surface. And the significance of that moment is not only in the action itself, but in what it revealed about your inner capacity. It showed that you are able to respond to something deeper than visible proof, even when clarity is still forming and everything is not yet fully understood. And that realization carries more weight than it may seem at first, because moments like that often become turning points that quietly separate one season from the next in a person's life. There is also something unfolding beneath the surface of everything you are experiencing, something connected to how you receive and interpret what begins to enter your life. Because stepping into a new season is not only about external change, but also about whether your inner awareness can recognize and hold what is starting to open for you. Over time, especially through long periods of pressure, uncertainty, or emotional strain, people naturally develop patterns in the way they perceive their reality. The way situations are interpreted, the way possibilities are evaluated, and even the way opportunities are recognized can all become shaped by what someone has been through. And without realizing it, those patterns can sometimes make it harder to fully see what is actually trying to emerge. This is why clarity becomes so important at this stage. Not just surface-level clarity, but a deeper kind of internal alignment that allows you to distinguish what is real, what is opening, and what is truly aligned with the direction you are moving toward. Because, as things begin to shift, not everything will present itself in an immediately obvious way. Some things will require discernment rather than instinctive reaction. And in moments like this, what matters most is not urgency, but clarity, the ability to quiet the internal noise just enough to notice what is genuinely moving and what is simply familiar. Distraction repeating itself in a new form. That level of awareness often becomes the difference between stepping into what is aligned with your path and overlooking it while it quietly unfolds in front of you. If you are beginning to notice even small signs of that kind of clarity emerging within you, if things that once felt tangled or uncertain are starting to feel slightly more distinguishable, then that is part of the inner adjustment taking place. You are learning a different way of seeing, one that is less reactive and more attuned to what is actually unfolding in real time. And from here, the focus naturally shifts once again, not toward forcing or striving for more, but toward seeing with greater clarity, so that what is meant for you is not only present in your life, but also fully recognizable when it arrives. Everything you have been moving through has been quietly shaping something deeper within you, even in the moments when it looked like nothing was changing on the surface. And now there is a subtle turning point forming, where your attention begins to shift and what you have been holding internally starts to loosen in a way that feels both unfamiliar and quietly necessary. It is not a sudden change, but more like an inner softening that has been building over time and is only now becoming noticeable. There are seasons where life requires you to hold things together through pure endurance, where you keep going even when nothing around you reflects what you feel inside. You hold on to direction, meaning, and something you cannot fully explain, and over time, that kind of persistence becomes a form of strength you almost stop recognizing, because it becomes your normal way of existing. But eventually, there comes a moment when that posture of constant holding is no longer required in the same way, and something in you begins to understand that shift. What starts to emerge in its place is a different kind of inner posture, one that is no longer defined by effort or strain, but by a quiet form of release. There is a gentle recognition that you do not have to keep proving, forcing, or carrying everything as if you are the only thing keeping it in motion. And for someone who has lived for a long time in the space of holding on, this change can feel both relieving and uncertain at the same time, as if part of you is finally allowed to exhale while another part is still adjusting to the unfamiliar stillness. So if there is anything within you that still feels responsible for making everything happen, for keeping every piece together, or for ensuring that everything unfolds correctly through constant effort, this is the moment where that grip can begin to soften. Not because what you cared about was unimportant or meaningless, but because it was never meant to depend entirely on your continuous striving in order to unfold. Something about the weight you have been carrying is no longer yours to hold in the same way. You are being invited into a different relationship with your path, one where you are not constantly reaching forward in tension, but slowly learning to recognize what is already forming around you. In that recognition, something within you begins to settle, almost as if your entire system is being given permission to stop bracing, stop anticipating resistance, and simply be present with what is already in motion. Beneath all of this, there is a deeper truth that becomes important to see with clarity. The step you took, the decision you made in a moment when you could not fully see what was ahead, was not only an external action in your life, it was also a revealing moment internally, one that showed you something about your own capacity to move forward, even without full certainty, without complete clarity. And while the outcome was still unfolding in real time, that kind of experience does not fade quickly. It stays with you and slowly becomes part of how you understand yourself moving forward, because when life asks you again to step into uncertainty, you will not be meeting it as someone who has never done it before. You will be meeting it with the memory of having already taken that step, and that memory becomes a quiet but steady form of inner strength. And now, standing in this in-between space, there is something you are being gently asked to release. Not the path itself, and not the meaning of what you have lived, but the invisible weight you have been carrying in silence. The pressure to constantly prove that what you believed in was real, the burden of holding everything together without visible support, and the quiet sense that you had to represent something before it fully revealed itself in your life. You were never meant to carry all of that indefinitely, and you do not need to continue holding it in the same way now. What you were sustaining through pure personal effort is no longer dependent on that same level of strain. There is something already in motion around you, a form of support that may not be fully visible yet, but is no longer absent. So you can begin to loosen your grip on the versions of this story that suggested delay meant failure, or that timing meant you were somehow wrong. You can gently release the comparisons, the imagined timelines, and the quiet judgments you placed on yourself during the waiting. And you can also let go of the smaller version of what you once believed was coming, the one shaped more by exhaustion and survival than by the fullness of what is actually possible, because what is unfolding now is not reduced, diminished, or made smaller by what you went through. It has not contracted to fit the difficult moments of your past. It remains whole, and it still carries the full depth of everything that was required to prepare you to receive it in its completeness. And as you begin to release what you have been holding, you are also creating space for something new to meet you, not something forced or rushed, and not something shaped by pressure, but something that arrives in its own timing and its own way, meeting you exactly where you are now, not where you were before. You are the one who chose to step forward at a time when everything around you was subtly, almost quietly, urging you to stay exactly where you were. The one who still moved ahead even when the path didn't fully make sense yet, even when the space around you felt uncertain, heavy, or resistant in ways you couldn't always explain. And in that moment, something inside your life shifted in a way that reaches deeper than surface events. Because it wasn't only the external direction that changed, it was something within you that crossed a threshold you only come to recognize later on, the kind of threshold that requires faith long before clarity ever arrives. Nothing you walked through in that season was without meaning, even if it often felt that way while you were inside it. Not the long quiet weeks where nothing seemed to respond, not the unanswered moments that left you wondering if anything was moving at all, and not the times you kept going without a single visible sign that your effort was being seen or acknowledged. Every one of those experiences was shaping something steady and resilient within you, building a kind of inner foundation that is now able to hold what is beginning to unfold. You were never truly falling behind, even when it felt like you were waiting in place, because in reality you will be informed with intention for what comes next. And now you are stepping into a turning point that is not distant or delayed, but already beginning to open within your present moment. It is not something far off that you are still trying to reach, but something that is quietly unfolding around you as you become aware of it, in the stillness of you pausing long enough to truly feel what is shifting. Something has already begun to move beneath the surface of your life. The waiting, in the way it once defined this season, is no longer holding the same shape or weight it once did. What has changed is not only the circumstances you can observe, but the deeper structure beneath them, the underlying reality that once held this entire season in place. And that kind of shift does not depend on visible proof or immediate confirmation. It is far more subtle than that. It is the kind of transformation that is first sensed inwardly, almost like an internal knowing, before it ever becomes clear in the external world. I want you to hear something clearly and without distortion. The weight you carried during this waiting was real, and the fact that you continued moving through it says something significant about who you have become in the process. That strength did not appear by chance or convenience. It was built slowly through experience, through endurance, and through moments where no one else could see what it cost you, just to keep your belief intact and your direction steady. And now there is an invitation forming to loosen your grip on what you no longer need to carry in the same way. Not the memories of what you lived through, but the pressure you placed on yourself to constantly prove that it all mattered, or that it had to be justified through outcome alone. You are no longer required to hold everything together as though the entire outcome depends solely on your constant effort. Something larger is already moving in connection with everything you have been building toward. Even with that, it is natural that a quiet uncertainty can still surface in moments like this. The thought may arise that if you step forward again, things might still not unfold the way you sense they could. That kind of fear does not point to a lack of faith within you. Instead, it reflects the depth of how much you have cared, how long you have waited, and how much emotional investment has already been poured into this path over time. But what is being asked of you now is a different kind of posture, one that is no longer defined by internal tension or constant bracing. It is a posture of clarity where you begin to see that you are no longer required to force what is already starting to move on its own. The conditions have shifted, even if everything has not yet fully revealed itself in a visible way. The step you took carries more significance than it may have felt like in the moment. It was not only an action but a form of alignment with something that was already in motion. It showed that you are able to respond even when certainty is still forming. That you can move in connection with what you sense internally rather than waiting for every detail to be fully explained before you act. And that experience quietly reshapes how you will meet everything that follows from here. There is a deeper recognition beginning to settle within you now. What you have become through all of this is not temporary or fragile. It is not incomplete or unstable. It has structure, it has depth, and it has the capacity to hold what is now beginning to enter your life in a more tangible way. So moving forward, the invitation is not to rush ahead and not to hold back in hesitation, but to see with greater clarity, to recognize what is genuinely opening in front of you, and to respond from that place of steadiness rather than from fear, doubt, or old uncertainty. And within that clarity, something begins to settle quietly inside you. Not everything is fully visible yet, but there is already a part of you that understands. You are no longer who you used to be, and what is coming toward you is not asking you to become someone else, but to stand fully as the person you've already become.